Hello everybody and welcome to the Queensland State Archives. My name is Timothy Roberts and I'm an art historian that concentrates my research on the art heritage and material culture of Queensland, particularly the time before the end of the Second World War. I am a councillor of the Royal Historical Society of Queensland and I'm president of the Professional Historians Association of Queensland. I'm also the 2019 Harry Gentle Resource Centre Visiting Fellow. Harry Gentle studied politics and history in the Griffith School of Humanities in the 1980s. He left a generous bequest to the university to support the ongoing study of Australian history to the 1850s. As a result of that bequest, the university has established the Harry Gentle Resource Centre, which is developing a portal of research dedicated to the study of Australia, with an initial focus on the area that would become Queensland in 1859. Benefaction such as this is enormously valuable to researchers, as it allows us to devote time and resources to projects that we otherwise may not be able to do. I am very much thankful to the university and to the Gentle family for their support. The project that I've been working on over the last year is the first major exploration of the art and artists of pre-separation Queensland. I've been creating an index of works of art that were created before 1859 and undertaking research into various themes that emerge through those works. Early art in Queensland has suffered somewhat of an indignity of being overlooked, with the work of artists operating in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania receiving much more attention. By casting our lens directly onto the work created here, we can plainly see that Queensland has a bountiful legacy of visual artistry that will certainly benefit from further investigation. Today I'm speaking on Yuggurral country and the Yuggurral and Turrbal people who lived and worked both where the State Archives is, here in Runcorn, and where I live in New Farm. Indigenous Australians were the first creators and visual artists in this area. We can see this in the elegant design and fine weaving of Jarwin that were created by artists up in northern rainforest regions near Cairns, and the highly detailed stencil art that was made by the Bidjara and Garringbal people in Carnarvon Gorge in central Queensland. I respectfully acknowledge the work of elders yesterday, today and tomorrow in ensuring that Australia's Indigenous history is kept alive and in the forefront of our mind. I do wish to advise viewers that while discussing William Westall's art in the Investigator voyage, there will be a portrait of a man who is now deceased. Australia's Indigenous communities began to be disrupted with progressive waves of explorers and colonists coming to Australian shores. Among these newcomers were artists and craftspeople who used art to respond to their surrounds. The voyage that I will begin with today is Cook's first voyage. In 1768, then 39-year-old Lieutenant James Cook and his crew travelled to Tahiti aboard the bark Endeavour to assist in the scientific observation of the transit of Venus. Cook was also presented with secret instructions, which directed him to search for a southern continent. Indeed, after observing the transit of Venus and charting the coast of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Endeavour sailed west, reaching the southeastern coast of what we now know as Australia on the 20th of April 1770. The secret instructions specified what was to be done from this point onwards. You are to employ yourself diligently in exploring as great an extent of the coast as you can, carefully observing the true situation thereof, both in latitude and longitude, the variation of the needle, bearings of headlands, height, direction and course of the tides and currents, depths and sounding of the sea, shoals, rocks, etc., and also surveying and making charts, and taking views of such bays, harbours and parts of the coast as may be useful to navigation. You are also to carefully observe the nature of the soil, the products thereof, the beasts and fowls that inhabit or frequent it, the fishes that are to be found in the rivers or upon the coast, and in what plenty, and in case you may find any mines, minerals, or valuable stones, you are to bring home specimens of each, and also such specimens of the seeds of trees, fruits, and grains as you may be able to collect, and transmit them to our secretary, that we may cause proper examination and experiments to be made upon them. You are likewise to observe the genius, temper, disposition, and number of the natives, if there be any, and endeavour by all proper means to cultivate a friendship and alliance with them, making them presents of such trifles as they may value, inviting them to traffic, and showing them every kind of civility and regard, taking care, however, not to suffer yourself to be surprised by them, but to always be upon your guard against any accidents. You are also, with the consent of the natives, to take possession of convenient situations in the country in the name of the King of Great Britain, or, if you find the country uninhabited, take possession for His Majesty by setting up proper marks and inscriptions as first discoverers and possessors. Cook diligently sailed north along the east coast of Australia, arriving at Botany Bay on the 28th of April 1770. The Endeavour proceeded north again on the 5th of May, reaching the coast that we now consider part of Queensland on 16 May. The Endeavour expedition was the first major exploration event in Queensland by European arrivals and lasted into August 1770. As the bark travelled along the coastline of Queensland, it stopped along the way for repairs and rest for the sailors, and also to allow members of the crew to carry out the exhaustive duty of recording flora and fauna, as well as connect with the local Indigenous communities along the coastline. Well over 300 sketches of flora and fauna were made by the ship's artist, Sydney Parkinson, along the coast of Queensland, from specimens that were observed and taken from the onshore expeditions of Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. Parkinson died on the voyage's return to England, but his sketches were brought back, and over the next decade, a select group of artists were charged with the task of turning these visual notes into finished drawings. The first drawing that I'd like to show you is a finished watercolour completed in 1778 by Frederick Polydore Nodder, after Parkinson's original sketches. This highly detailed watercolour depicts the leaves and flowers of the native kapok tree, scientifically known as Cochlospermum gillivrae. Specimens of kapok have been observed and collected at Endeavour River, where the ship was berthed for over 6 weeks to undertake repairs. It grows in the wet tropical regions of far north Queensland and Arnhem Land, and as you can see, Nodder's watercolour is quite accurate in terms of the representation of the flower. Nodder's watercolour has an inscription that reads, "The srirachas are small, sharp, and more distant." This is a note to the engravers who were tasked with cutting these drawings onto the plate so they could be produced as part of Joseph Banks's Florilegium. It was an ambitious project to introduce a lot of new species that were discovered during the Endeavour's journey to the scientific world through art and text. Nodder's watercolour was cut by Gerald Sibelius, and the resulting image you can see on the right of this slide. As you can see, the image is in reverse, but the impression is remarkably fine overall and is a testament to both Nodder and Sibelius's abilities to interpret the original sketches. Another watercolour that was inspired by Queensland plants is Hoya australis, or the wax vine. This hardy climber likes rocky environments on the outskirts of rainforests and can be found along most of the Queensland coast. I remember this growing in my backyard in the south of Brisbane as a child. Specimens were observed by the Endeavour crew at Endeavour River and Cape Grafton. James Miller interpreted Parkinson's sketch to create this finished watercolour around 1773 to 75. And once again, Gerald Sibelius would translate this image onto the engraver's plate for the Florilegium. You can see here, though, that a single strand of vine has been isolated for the purposes of the drawing, which gives less of an idea of the plant's overall appearance, but rather a finer look at the features of the stem, leaves, and flowers. I'd like to give you an indication of the extraordinary detail that the artists went to while they were completing these finished drawings for the project. Here is Frederick Nodder's finished watercolour of Melaleuca viridiflora, or the broadleaf paperbark, which he did in 1777. You can see in these watercolours that the plant has been drawn with revisions to the flowers that can be folded over. And if we do go into the finer details of the work, you can see how much incredible attention has been paid to the stems and also to the leaf veins on those leaves. Banks's Florilegium was never completed. It was a vast project and it was enormously costly, and the production of the engraving plates stalled in the mid-1780s. Resultantly, no plates were pulled during Sir Joseph Banks's lifetime. The plates ended up in the British Museum, which has ensured their survival, and it wasn't until the early years of the 20th century that some of the plates were first pulled. But since then, several editions of impressions have been made, perhaps the most famous done throughout the 1980s. As an aside, I'd like to briefly talk about the curious problem that Banks, Solander and others in the voyage encountered. At the time, taxonomic descriptions were limited to the structural similarities of different organisms. We didn't yet have Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. We were in the very early years of microscopy, so we didn't have that information to work with either. So basically, if several organisms should share similar features, they may be related. Because Australia had been isolated for so long, the evolution of plants and animals in our corner of the globe was vastly different to anything that had been encountered anywhere else. And this is perhaps perfectly exemplified by this fellow, the kangaroo. Macropods had been recorded by Banks and Cook along the coastline of Australia, but it wasn't until the Endeavour was berthed at Endeavour River for repairs that the animals were observed more closely, shot and even savoured. Daniel Solander took rather extensive notes of the animal, but the difficulty in comparing the kangaroo to any other animal known in the world is beautifully summed up by Cook in his diary entry of the 14th of July 1770. Mr. Gore, being in the country, shot one of the animals before spoke of. It was a small one of the sort, weighing only 28 pounds, clear of the entrails. Its body was long, the head, neck and shoulders very small in proportion to the other parts. It was hare-lipped, and the head and ears were most like a hare's of any animal I know, and the tail was nearly as long as the body, thick next to the rump and tapering towards the end. The forelegs were 8 inches long, and the hind 22. Its progression is by hopping or jumping 7 or 8 feet at each hop upon its hind legs only, for it makes no use of the fore, which seem to be only designed for scratching in the ground. The skin is covered with a short, hairy fur of a dark mouse or grey colour. It bears no sort of resemblance to any European animal I ever saw. It is said to bear much resemblance to the jerboa, excepting in size, the jerboa being no larger than a common rat. Cook's voyage was not the only exploratory expedition to be undertaken in Queensland coastline. From 1801 to 1803, Lieutenant Matthew Flinders led the Investigator on a voyage to circumnavigate Australia, chart the coastline of the continent, and undertake further research into the natural history of the continent. A number of important personalities were part of this expedition, namely Robert Brown, a botanist who would later become the keeper of Sir Joseph Banks's library and herbarium, and keeper of the Banksian Botanical Collection at the British Museum, and also Ferdinand Bauer, a botanical illustrator who had previously worked for the Royal Botanical Garden at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. Another artist, William Westall, was engaged to produce landscape and figural paintings during the expedition. The Investigator charted the Queensland coastline from July to December 1802, and during this time Westall made over 30 sketches and a quantity of watercolours of the things that he saw. In 1809, the Admiralty commissioned several large-scale paintings from Westall as a way to evidence the outcomes of the voyage, which allowed the artist to reflect upon these travels a second time over. The sketches and watercolour that Westall made on the Investigator are not only highly detailed records of the Queensland coast, they show a different treatment of exploration to what I've shown you so far. The meticulous scientific analysis of flora and fauna that we saw in the work of Sydney Parkinson on the Endeavour was the responsibility of Ferdinand Bauer aboard the Investigator, which afforded Westall an opportunity to take a more holistic approach when depicting the southern continent in his works of art. His vistas and vantage points give us a proper sense of the enormity of the natural world and provide insights into how the plants live together and interact with the geology. Westall's pencil sketches along the Queensland coast range from studies of individual plants to panoramas, topical charts and depictions of Indigenous life. For example, Here we can see a very detailed sketch of Keppel Bay. Here, a sketch of Thirsty Sound. And here, a sketch of a Darambal or Guanmal man from the Shoalwater Bay region. Westall also produced a number of watercolours on the voyage as well. In 1809, Westall was commissioned by the British Admiralty to produce oil paintings from his sketches in Australia as one way to highlight the outcomes of the voyage. The paintings are quite grand in scale and really for the first time show the Australian landscape in that grand English painting tradition. The paintings also afforded an opportunity to be examined against the artist's sketches, which we will now do in 3 paintings. Westall's view of Port Bowen is undeniably one of the most striking paintings in the group of commissions. It depicts a southeast-facing panorama that surveys Watering Gully and Port Bowen, now known as Port Clinton, about 80 kilometres north of Yeppoon. Comparing the work to Westall's pencil sketch of the scene, we can see that the work has been largely faithful in its viewpoint, with minimal alteration of the picture's characteristics. This wasn't the case with all of his works, though. Westall's view of the Murray Islands, with the natives offering to barter, was drawn from several earlier works that evidence a distinctive change in viewpoint. Westall based this work on 2 pencil sketches, a view of Dar with its seafaring vessels in the foreground, and a finer sketch of the large seafaring boat with about 20 people on board. You can clearly see in this initial sketch of the seascape that the island is quite prominent in the work. When Westall completed his watercolour of the view, the island once again is the feature, and it is clear that the artist has paid special attention to that boat in the foreground. The dark tones applied to the island and the pink tones in the sky give the work a rather dusky atmosphere. The finished oil painting, however, presents a slightly different view of the scene. Here, the vessel and crew are the feature of the work. The artist has reduced the number of people on the boat to about 15, still quite a large crew, but the view of Dara is much less prominent in this final painting. And here we can see a comparison of how the work had changed over time. The third painting that we will visit today is one of the first paintings in the series executed. It was exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1810. It depicts Townsend and Leicester Islands from a vantage point on Mount Westall, a short distance north of Port Clinton. Westall's initial pencil sketch was quite loose, with the greatest attention paid to the islands in the distance rather than any detail in the foreground. The final oil painting, however, is a really grand thing and it measures over 1 metre in width. Westall treated the work with an early morning aspect, and you can see the reflection of the rising sun in the water, and it casts this impressive light right across the picture plane. You can also see that the artist has treated the foreground quite dramatically. He's increased the prominence of those rocky outcrops on the top of the mountain and added human figures to highlight the impressive scale of the landscape. When you have a comparison of the two works, you can really see how Westall has worked with the perspective to give the enormity of the geology. Matthew Flinders published an account of the Investigator's voyage under the title A Voyage to Terra Australis in 1814. Included within that work were several engravings of Westall's paintings done by John Pye, including a view from Port Bowen. A curious and important footnote about how much further this promoted Westall's paintings of the Australian landscape is that 4 of these Westall images, once again including view of Port Bowen, are copied into the panels within both the Newcastle's Collector's Chest, previously known as the Macquarie and Dixon Collector's Chests, that are held in the State Library of New South Wales. These paintings were executed around 1817 or 1818, and they're most probably by Joseph Lycett under the instruction of James Wallace. Today, Westall's oil paintings for the Investigator voyage are held in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and many of Westall's original pencil sketches and some watercolours are held in the National Library of Australia. Another noteworthy coastal expedition was the Rattlesnake Expedition that surveyed Queensland and New Guinea coastline of the 1840s. I'm really conscious of time at the moment. We do have a lot to get through in this discussion today, but I did want to throw in one work of art purely for aesthetic reasons to show the kind of delights that we come across when we're undertaking our research. This voyage was captained by Owen Stanley, and Oswald Brearley and Thomas Huxley were always making visual notes throughout the voyage. The Mitchell Library holds an extensive quantity of papers and works from that voyage, including an album that's titled Drawings of Australia and credited to Owen Stanley. Most of the images are landscape views of Sydney, Melbourne and other parts of the continent, but the last 9 images in the album are very detailed botanical illustrations that are mostly from the Sydney region. I hope that you experience the same kind of delight that I felt when I came across this image of Gossypium sturtium, or the Sturt's desert rose, that was examined in Rockingham Bay in 1848. This image has been tucked away in an album for the larger part of 170 years, which has just made those colours as fresh as the day they were painted. It's like a little jewel, and it makes the hours that we spend in repositories looking for things quite satisfying. Though much art in Queensland during the late 18th and first half of the 19th century was concerned with exploration and discovery of new places and species, after the settlement of Moreton Bay in 1824, we begin to see a second thread emerging in the visual art of North Australia, which depicts establishment. Many admirers of Queensland's history will know of this panorama of the settlement in Moreton Bay. Taken from the southern bank of the river, near the location of the modern-day Victoria Bridge and Queensland Cultural Centre, it was sketched by Henry Boucher Bowen in 1835. At the time that this image was made, Moreton Bay was a penal settlement. You can see in the top left of the image the windmill, which was used as a treadmill punishment for convicts. Around the Moreton Bay fig in the left of the image is the surgeons' quarters and hospital buildings. Next to this is the prisoners' barracks with its high stone wall. At the centre of the image you can see the military barracks, and closest to the river on the right is the commissariat store. Bowerman's image gives us an indication of what the settlement looked like, but we can use other sources to give a more complete picture of the settlement. Here at QSA, a number of maps and architectural drawings of buildings that have made up the penal settlement are cared for, and fortunately these have been digitised so all Queenslanders can explore this aspect of our history. If you are interested in searching historical architectural plans, you can find them in the QSA Archive Search Catalogue under Series ID 3739. This detailed plan shows the layout of the prisoners' barracks. We don't often think of these kind of schematics as works of art, but they provide a different level of detail that enriches our understanding of the landscape at the time. From this plan, we get more of a sense of how the building was laid out and the construction methods used, particularly in regards to the roofing of this building. Similarly, in this plan of the surgeons' quarters and hospitals, we can see the elevation plans and we can see the detail on the construction treatment, which go right down to the door and window fixtures, as well as the internal plans of the buildings, which give archaeologists, historians and architects a sense of how the buildings operated about 180 years ago. The Moreton Bay Colony was opened to free settlement in 1842, and from them we see a progressive expansion of the community from the 1840s onwards. At the same time, people were seeing opportunity within the region, and the land west on the Darling Downs was so popular that by November 1841, one commentator wrote in the Omnibus and Sydney Spectator, "I believe there is no doubt that all the stations on the Darling Downs have been taken up. Parties who now want runs go over the range to the Moreton Bay side." In the Moreton Bay settlement itself, after the commencement of free settlement, we do see an increasing number of people arriving, among them artists. For example, in 1843, just a year after the colony was open for free settlement, we see this very sweet sketch of the community from the southern bank of the river by John Henry Goldfinch, an Englishman that visited Australia and New Zealand from 1842 until 1851. And later, Conrad Martins travelled to the colony late 1851, early 1852. This is an 1855 watercolour based on a pencil sketch that he took in November and December 1851. We'll return to Martins a little bit later. In 1855, artist and naturalist Sylvester Diggle settled in Brisbane. He was a really active member of the community. He founded the Brisbane Choral Society and the Queensland Philosophical Society in 1859 and the Brisbane Philharmonic Society in 1861. Diggles is best known for his ornithological study, publishing the Ornithology of Australia between 1865 and 1870 and a companion to Gould's Handbook in 1877. A quantity of his watercolours relating to these publications are held in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, and one of Diggle's sketchbook, dating from 1853 to 54, has been digitised by the Harry Gentle Resource Centre. It's available to view through the Projects tab at www.harrygentle.com.au. In 1858, Diggle sketched several pencil views of Brisbane, and today these are held in the Queensland Art Gallery. The beautiful thing about these sketches are their honesty. They're not in any way grand historic vistas that were made for posterity. Rather, they honestly depict different corners of the colony with an unpretentious attention to detail. Here, we see that familiar view of North Brisbane from the southern side of the river. The commissariat store is again visible, and in the centre of the image, we see St John's Church. Another view of North Brisbane, this time from Kangaroo Point, facing where the modern-day Riverside Centre would be, shows the rather ramshackle huts in the foreground, and across the river on the city side we have the more urbanised wharves. In this view of Kangaroo Point, we can see a variety of buildings, from basic bark huts to more substantial timber and masonry structures. You can get a real character here from the uneven surface of the road. And you see that again in this sketch of New Farm, Fortitude Valley, where rocks and felled trees are evidencing development that is going on in the area. Finally, this view, which was taken from New Farm looking across the river towards Kangaroo Point, shows two splendid riverfront residences, including Shaftesbury House with its 3 dormer windows in the foreground. This view that I introduced before of Conrad Martins of Brisbane is an appropriate work to segue into our final topic of today's discussion, edification. On the 28th of August 1847, William Baker wrote in Heads of the People, an illustrated journal of literature, whims and oddities and the artistic pursuits within the colony. True, self predominates in the orders given for portraits. Ships and my horse and my house make up the subject of all the pictures, and vanity pays for these at a reasonable rate. This jestful comment on Australia's patrons of the arts in the late 1840s underscores the self-made character that is common to many personalities at the time. People who came to Australia in these earlier decades of colonisation usually fell into 2 categories. They were either convicts who had received their ticket and leave, and who had gone on to establish businesses to earn a modest or in some cases substantial fortune, or they were wealthier individuals who saw an opportunity to invest in a future that may not have been possible in England. The same article goes on to list a few artists that were working in the colony. These include Oswald Brearley, who you remember was on the Rattlesnake. He was described as a maritime painter unrivalled here, and also Conrad Martins, who was described as our first landscape painter. Martins was an artist who was based in Sydney, and he travelled to Queensland in November 1851. His arrival was heralded by the Brisbane Courier, which reported, "We understand that Mr. Conrad Martins, who arrived as a passenger by the Turoa yesterday, was formerly draftsman on board the HMS Beagle, and intends making sketches of the scenery in the district prior to his return to Sydney." Martins sketched various properties around Brisbane for the first fortnight of his time in Queensland, before travelling to the Darling Downs via Cunningham's Gap. While on the Downs, Martins worked prolifically and produced dozens of pencil sketches of the region. Central to these were sketches of the pastoral stations that, though barely a decade old, were now a key feature of the Downs. After working on the Downs for the greater part of 3 months, he returned to Sydney and continued nurturing relationships that he'd formed in Queensland to secure commissions for paintings. Martins kept records of his commissions, and so we know that he was quickly patronised by David McConnell, who ordered 5 small views relating to his residence, Bulimba House, in May 1852. His brother John soon followed with orders for 3 views of Cressbrook, the McConnell family station on the Darling Downs. Among the incoming orders for paintings, we see in December 1852 another Darling Downs resident, George Leslie, placing an order for a large watercolour of his station, Canning Downs. Martins worked on this watercolour from a sketch that he made on the 10th of March 1852, which is now held in the Mitchell Library. Brothers Patrick, Walter and George Leslie are credited as the first European settlers on the Darling Downs. Alan Cunningham had already explored the Downs in 1827, but we first see commercial interest in the Downs in early 1840 when Patrick Leslie and a convict named Peter Murphy arrived at the Condamine to explore lands suitable for squatting. Leslie's brothers Walter and George were close behind him, and a party of 22 men and about 6,000 head of stock arrived on the Condamine on the 4th of June 1840. By July, the Leslies had undertaken further exploration and had decided to squat on a very large parcel of land, which was subsequently split into 2 runs, Tulburra and Canning Downs. George Leslie was the member for New South Wales Legislative Council for the pastoral districts of Clarence and the Darling Downs from 1851 to 1855, before he returned to England due to ill health. It would be over a year after the first watercolour was purchased before Leslie reconnected with Martins regarding works of art. In late 1853, his brother Patrick ordered two small sketches of a Goombarra homestead, and George Leslie placed for more orders in paintings in the second half of 1854. 4 large landscapes of the Downs, namely Coochin Run, Killarney, Canning Downs, Heifer Station, Canning Downs, and Crossing Place, Canning Downs, entered the Leslies' collection. Again, we're very fortunate to have the original sketches for these, and they're preserved in the Mitchell Library. And here we can see the sketches for Heifer Station and Crossing Place, which were made on the 11th and 12th of March 1852. As I mentioned before, Martins kept a record of his commissions, and this document gives us a sort of who's who of the Downs through the 1850s. Looking through the commissions, we can see that aside from the Leslies and the McConnells, Henry Stuart Russell ordered paintings of Cecil Plains Station in June 1852. John Balfour ordered 2 paintings of Collinston Station in July 1852. Arthur Hodgson, an early settler on the Downs and owner of Eaton Vale Station, commissioned 3 works in 1853. The same year, Henry Mort placed orders for depictions of Franklin Vale, and in 1854, his brother-in-law, James Laidley, placed an order for 2 paintings. Other notable names, including Gore, Davidson, and Chalice, also appear in the records. There is an interesting comparison to be made between Martins' watercolours of pastoral holdings on the Darling Downs and other artistic expressions around Australia. In 1855, Austrian-born artist Eugène von Gerard received his first commission to paint Fulham Grange, the farm of Richard and Elizabeth Perry, located in the modern northwest Melbourne suburb of Alphington. Over the next 12 years, von Gerard would continue to source significant commissions from station owners in Victoria, painting representations of Kangaton, Deep Creek, Dunmore, Snake Creek, and Yalla Ipura stations, an impressive pair of views of Purrumbete, and a double panorama of the Gippsland Alps from Bushy Park, among others. Like Martins, von Gerard would make several detailed sketches of the location he was visiting before returning to his studio in Melbourne and translating these visual notes into finished oil paintings. In 1856, 2 more works by Martins come into George Leslie's collection. The first, Brisbane, is a splendid watercolour that depicts Brisbane City from Bowen Terrace. The second is arguably the most spectacular of Martins' works in Queensland. Forrest Cunningham's Gap depicts a lone traveller on horseback negotiating the passage along the Great Dividing Range between Moreton Bay and the Downs. The country was mountainous and unsuitable for larger convoys or drays, but the passage through Cunningham's Gap was undeniably scenic, and we can see this in Martins' image with the enormous ancient trees and the dappled sunlight streaming through. The Martins watercolours from George Leslie's collection entered the Queensland Art Gallery in 1998 with the generous support of private benefactors from the gallery's foundation and further financial support of the Queensland Government. This group of paintings is indeed a most significant snapshot of Queensland history. Finally, as an art historian who focuses a lot of my time on decorative arts, it would be remiss of me to omit some early decorative arts. In 2009, the State Library of Queensland acquired a large and handsome medallion that was presented to Alexander MacLeod as a gesture of appreciation from the officers and brothers of the Loyal Ipswich Lodge. The medallion was presented to MacLeod at a dinner on the 20th of August 1850, exactly 1 year after the first meeting of that lodge. MacLeod was acknowledged for his unwearied exertions as founder and friend of the lodge, but regrettably, we know nothing else of the man to whom this handsome work of art was presented. The medallion is sizable. It measures just over 10.5 centimetres or 4 inches in diameter. The central plate of the medallion bears details of the presentation and is surrounded by intricately carved lettering that reads Advance Australia and is surmounted with an emu and kangaroo, the latter of which is reminiscent of that marvellous George Stubbs painting, The Kangaroo of New Holland. It wasn't manufactured locally though, as we didn't really have manufacturing silversmith in Queensland until about 1859 or 1860 by the name of Augustus Cosfitz. Instead, this work was made by Sydney silversmith Joel John Cohen, who made other fine testimonial pieces, agricultural medals and tableware. In the 1850s, you may have had to have products imported from the southern colonies or even overseas that weren't able to be supplied locally, provided that you had the pecuniary resources to do so. If you did want to learn more about this exceptional piece, former curator of original materials at the State Library of Queensland, Diane Byrne, wrote a very informative article on the medallion for the August 2012 edition of Australiana magazine. That brings me to a close of today's discussion on Queensland art, and I hope that you found it informative and enjoyable. Over the coming months, the Harry Gentle Resource Centre will be uploading more material on early art and material culture in Queensland. I'd like to extend a big thank you to the team at the QSA for their efforts in bringing this presentation together. There are quite a few people behind the scenes who have coordinated the IT and audience engagement for this event. Please do stay safe and remember to practice social distancing. I do look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.